One APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm, fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battle-Born Progress. Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt, as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.
To Out in Front. My name is Annette, and I'm the Executive Director of Battle-Born Progress, and I am finally back with you after having COVID last week, and Will filling in for me last minute because I couldn't breathe. So I am back. Wear a mask, get vaccinated if you haven't already, because that probably is why I'm here with you today. So we're going to get right into it. There's a lot going on. First, before we start, I actually just wanted to note that unfortunately, there was just a major bridge collapse in Southern Nevada on the US 95 and Eastern, and there is somebody trapped. So obviously we are praying for them. Hope everybody is okay, and hope that they can get that scene cleared up very quickly and that nobody was hurt. So thinking about everyone, it's on Twitter right now. We'll be sharing it and keeping you all updated on that. But I want to get to what happened over the last 24 hours with voting rights. Obviously, last night, the U.S. Senate was not able to do their jobs thanks to Republicans and Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. And so we are going to be talking about that and also the Roe versus Wade anniversary this weekend and more. So I want to bring in our guests this evening. As always, these are our returning guests who come and love to talk shit with me on a regular basis. So the first person I want to introduce is Emily Persaud-Zamora. She is the executive director of Silver State Voices. I'll have her introduce herself in a second. Also, my sister in the movement, Laura Martin. She is the executive director of the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada, also known as PLAN. And then fellow troublemaker, Bradley Schrager. He is our attorney and the attorney to many around the state. So thank you all for being with us again this week. Emily, I want to start with you. You know, you and I have done a lot of work on voting rights over the past 2 sessions. Here in Nevada. Luckily, Nevada is not terrible when it comes to voting rights, but we are seeing the rest of the country going backwards. So what happened last night to the Freedom to Vote Act, and what is next now in this fight?
Thanks, Annette, and thank you so much for having me. As you said, I'm the executive director of Silver State Voices, and we have done a lot of work with our 19 table partners in the Nevada legislature in the last two sessions around voting rights. But, you know, we're really lucky in the state of Nevada to have done a lot of this work and passed monumental pieces of legislation, but that's definitely not the case across the country. And that's why we had so much hope in the John Lewis Act yesterday. It was the last 2 days, it was heard in the Senate. You saw numerous senators say some pretty horrific things. And then you saw some pretty amazing senators say, why we really need a federal piece of legislation. Unfortunately, all of the Republican senators voted against it. And two, which I mean, in my opinion, they might as well be Republicans, Senators Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin vote against the piece of legislation. And so at this point, we don't know what exactly is going to happen with this bill. The president has said that him and the vice president are going to continue being pretty vocal about this, and they're not going to stop. And so, I really think that 2022 is the year that it needs to get done. And so, we'll keep, I think locally, we're going to keep being very vocal about it. I think what's really good about this, Annette, is that we're seeing a lot of national organizations and a lot of people who don't really normally have an opinion on voting rights be really vocal about why it's so important to prioritize voting rights. And I think, as a table, it's something that we really talk about. We have partners that work on criminal justice issues, reproductive justice, and we often talk about all of our issues cannot be accomplished. No progress could be accomplished if we're not prioritizing democracy. And I think that this conversation is finally getting people to see that.
Yeah, and really quick before we move to Laura to talk more about that, talk to us about the bills that the partners and all of us worked on during the last session. All four of us worked on these bills, and I know so many of our partners worked on these bills, but what are those pieces of legislation that we were able to pass here in Nevada, and why was that so critical, especially, with the fact that we're still living in a global pandemic? People, once again, are going to have trouble accessing the ballot box potentially for safety reasons and things like that. Why were these pieces of legislation so critical, and what were they?
Yeah, I mean, there are several, but I'm going to just highlight maybe two or three for the sake of time. One of my favorite ones is AB 431, and that was passed in 2019. And that is the automatic restoration of voting rights to formerly incarcerated individuals. Prior to 2017, if you have been convicted of a felony conviction, once you were released, you did not get your right back to vote. In most states in the United States, you actually don't get your right back to vote. There are only two that automatically, I think a few years ago, only two that gave it back. I would say that is one of my favorite ones. Assembly Bill 345, that's the largest voting rights bill ever in the state of Nevada, that did some amazing things like same-day voter registration, also known as SDR. It implemented automatic voter registration. It did things like allow more than one 16-year-old or 17-year-old to be a poll worker. I could go on and on and on about that. And then I would say my other personal favorite is Assembly Bill 321, that allows us to send mail-in ballots to all states. To all registered voters. It allows for drop boxes to be at polling locations. And I think that these are really important pieces of legislation, because we've really seen that it makes voting more accessible for Nevadans. Not exactly what other states are doing, but I think that we've really been clear in leading the pathway as to what should accessibility of voting rights look like for our voters.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Emily. And just a reminder for the audience watching at home, we will get to audience questions in just a little bit. I have a couple questions for our panel this evening, and then we'll get to your questions. So put your questions in the chat. We're happy to get to them, happy to answer them, and happy to tell you more about all of the things that are happening with voting rights and more. So Laura, I want to come to you. Obviously, PLAN has a long and proud history of working on voting rights and democracy issues, especially for people of color. And what would this bill have meant for people of color in this country? Oftentimes we see voter suppression efforts aimed at people of color and specific communities to make it harder for those communities to vote. So what would this have done on a national level to kind of help us move forward? You're on mute, babe.
Oh my gosh, rookie mistake. So it would have provided some of the benefits that Nevadans have to all people. Your ability to, freely exercise your constitutional right to vote shouldn't depend on the state that you reside in. But to pull it back a little farther, like Emily is saying, without democracy, without a functioning democracy, we can't do business. We can't really do anything. That is the first step in taking away many of our rights. And like we said last year, after the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, this is an expected outcome from a political party and a political ideology that doesn't see Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color as being worthy of deciding their own fate and electing their own leaders. So, Mitch McConnell, people say that he said the quiet part out loud by differentiating between African Americans and Americans, but people like him don't see us as Americans. They don't see us as needing these same rights. And so that's why, I believe, what's his name? Joe Manchin, he mentioned the other day when he was Secretary of State, he never heard of voter suppression. He probably did, but he didn't care because it was the type of people who are suffering from it. And so there shouldn't have to be this hopscotch system of this state has great voter protection, this state doesn't. Hopefully we'll get into talking about the VRA and what happened there and why it has become easier to do really silly things like arrest people for giving someone a bottle of water as they wait outside for 8 hours to vote. And again, this isn't just something where, people are just wanting the red carpet treatment like we love in Las Vegas. This really is simply seeing that certain people are finally finding their voices at the ballot boxes, claiming their equity and power in their communities. And there are people, the good old boys who don't like that change, who don't like the changing demographics of our country, and to see that people are finally able to actually practice democracy and allow our country to really meet its full potential and promise.
So let's talk about the VRA. Obviously there were changes made to the VRA. I should say it was basically stripped. Section 4 in particular, that was part of what helped us uphold democracy and make sure that, we can uphold voting rights for people. And in addition to that, we also know that, an election should not decide how voting rights look state by state. Like you said, this patchwork framework that we have. If we get the wrong Secretary of State in Nevada, things could go backwards here too. And we have to be vigilant now all the time. That's why a federal law is so important, is so we don't have this patchwork framework that you're talking about. So let's talk about the VRA and how that kind of comes into all of this, Laura, and why that's so important to have this federal law.
Yeah, as we know, the Voting Rights Act is gutted, and because Mitch McConnell went nuclear several times and got some great Supreme Court justices in for Donald Trump, we just can't risk, again, like you said, election by election, patchwork remedies for voting rights. There has to be a federal remedy, because without a strong democracy, it's impossible to move forward on so many different things. Imagine not having a strong democracy and trying to fight for housing rights. Where's the accountability? Where's the chain of command? Where are the people who actually hold the power and can make decisions? We've already seen, people running for U.S. Senate and denouncing this bill have already been in their own pay-to-play corruption drama schemes. And so what does it mean if
feel free to say his name, Adam Laxalt? Let's just
Yes.
name him, because he's a terrible person.
So what does it mean people with that ideology can then control who gets to vote and when they get to vote and where they get to vote? We've passed things like, and I'll just say it now because I don't know if we have time to get into it later. I see a lot of people, elected officials, talking about all the laws that would have been passed. But make no mistake, those laws would not have been passed if it had not been for progressive activists. Because I've definitely sat across the table from legislators trying to get automatic restoration of rights for many legislative sessions. And they said it made them look soft on crime, and they didn't want to do it. We knew ballot collection was good for Indigenous folks. In the rural parts of the state who don't get regular mail service, we were told that would not look good. They couldn't message that. We have to do things that are good for our folks. People can take the credit and make long Twitter threads, but the bottom line, it's the people who are organizing, the activists who have to make it happen. We have to tell our stories about what is actually happening in the community and just fight like hell to get it done. And I think that's what we have to do on the federal level as well. We're lucky that we have 2 strong US senators, but they could also be showing leadership. We need to be toughening up Chuck Schumer. We need to be pushing cinema. I don't think the senator from South Carolina, Tim Scott, is getting the scrutiny that he deserves as the only Black Republican in the Senate. And, he represents South Carolina, where my family is from, who, my dad still has physical scars on his body from being harassed for trying to vote. So it's good that we have some yes votes, but we also need to show some leadership and push our Senate colleagues to get this over the finish line.
I couldn't agree more. Like, we cannot stop here just because the vote went down last night. This is too important to not keep pushing. Bradley, I want to come to you. Thank you for always joining us and giving us your perspective on this stuff too. Voting rights are crucial to our democracy, as we just talked about with Emily and Laura. How is it legal to suppress voting rights when it is a constitutional right for us to be able to vote? And then in addition to that, how is it legal to pass laws that limit voting hours, voting machines available to people? It makes it harder for people with disabilities to vote, as we've heard during testimony, all of these things that should be illegal.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. Good to see you all again. You sort of built in the answer to your own question, which is, we're not in a situation anymore where you can pass a law or openly stop this or that group from casting their votes at the polls. So that's not how you do it. What you do is you build the roadblocks that make it more than inconvenient, annoying, physically challenging, practically difficult, so that you are suppressing populations to a degree that it can be effective in close elections, especially in a closely divided nation like this. So you do things that create longer lines. You take advantage of laws that say you must have at least one polling place per however many people, and if you go to a wealthier or a different type of constituency, there are plenty of machines and plenty of parking and opportunities to vote, and your experience is quick and easy. So it seems to you as though, what are these people talking about when you talk about vote suppression? And then you go to places in Ohio or South Carolina or Georgia, where the lines stretch around the blocks and people need to spend hours and hours of their day just to cast a ballot. That's the kind of thing that will drive people not to bother to vote, or to turn around and go home, or to give up on election day. Especially if you can make it all in person and make it as inconvenient as possible. I mean, and to do this, the right employs this notion of election integrity. They believe that somehow the left or the Democrats are smuggling elections away from them and fraudulently changing votes there's no narrative at the moment on the right that embraces, okay, let's find a way for everybody to cast a vote. Let's have a democracy where everybody can quickly and easily express their choices at the ballot box, right? There's no narrative like that. It is all this paranoid conspiracy notion that is driving, let's not send ballots to people, no matter how secure they can be. I don't trust the machines in front of my face because I obviously can't check the receipt of the paper ballot that the machine generates. So it isn't that it's legal to suppress votes openly. What's legal is to nibble around the edges and build walls that people will feel frustrated over and not climb over in order to exercise what ought to be the easiest thing we do in society, which is to express your democratic choice.
Yeah, so some opposition, which I do not agree with, obviously, to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act has been that it gives too much power to the states. I always love this argument because Republicans always get sideways on this. They want some states' rights, but not all. Don't get crazy on these states' rights. So it's saying that the federal government would oversee state elections. What are your thoughts on this, especially in light of the horrendous voter suppression laws that have swept through the southern states recently, especially?
Yeah, I mean, Laura talked about the fall of the Voting Rights Act, which, it's hard to believe that was more than a decade ago now that happened. And we lost what was known as pre-clearance, which was essentially federal oversight over election processes in states and localities with histories of racial and other discrimination in voting practices. 10 years on, constitutionally, Congress still has the last word on the structure and regulation of federal elections. Now, in this country, we hold state and federal elections on the same day, at the same time. So at elections in which federal officials are being elected, Congress can regulate those. Now, that's not necessarily true of state elections. So, states still have the ability to structure their elections for state offices in a manner that is consistent with the U.S. Constitution, but is in fact, locally determined. And so, these things always tend to come out of Texas, much like what the sort of clever thing they did with reproductive rights. Texas has floated the idea of not holding state elections on the same day or at the same time as federal elections, so that they can run their state elections literally any way they want to on a day that isn't a federal election. That would be disastrous, obviously, in a place like Texas. And if that caught on, much like the reproductive rights disaster we saw out of Texas, that would be horrible for the rest of the country. But Congress still does, at this moment, Congress still has the last word on regulating elections where federal officers, the president, your representatives, your senators, are elected. And so, given what we've seen in the 10 years since the rollback of the Voting Rights Act, it seems to me that baselines established in the John Lewis bill and in the Freedom to Vote Act are in fact crucially important if this republic is going to survive.
Absolutely. So Emily, I want to come back to you really quickly. What do you think the most important parts or provisions in the Freedom to Vote Act were, and why do you think this is so needed at a time like this?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of different pieces that I think are really critical from the Freedom to Vote Act. One is that it requires 14 days of early voting. For us here in the state of Nevada, we have that already. And we're lucky that our registrars make a really intentional effort of making that super available. But there are states in this day and age that don't even have early voting. Some may have a week, or it's very sporadic. Like, I have a lot of family that live in Georgia, and their early voting system, it's garbage. Like, there's no comparison. I would say that additional things are that it establishes same-day voter registration. We implemented that for the first time in 2020, and we saw the effects that it has on people that, for whatever they're experiencing in their life, the hustle and bustle, they forgot to register to vote or what have you, and realize that it's election day or the last day of early voting, and they could go to their site and register to vote and cast their ballot. It requires that the voting rights be restored to formerly incarcerated individuals. And that would be, I think, a monumental piece of legislation where we are giving voting rights back to a large segment of the community. And honestly, I would say one of my favorites is that it establishes no excuse vote by mail. And I think this piece I really want to hone into. I was watching a press conference the other day from the Senate where they were talking about this particular piece. And, one of the reporters was asking around, well, isn't this only really like a Democratic thing? The states, only Democratic blue states have vote by mail. That's wrong, actually. The state of Utah has had vote by mail for quite some time, and they are a very Republican state, and there hasn't been anything wrong that's happened in their state. If anything, they have been able to show that it's been successful. Their voters love using it. And so why can't we have a vote by mail all across the country? It is such an easy way of voting for so many people who may not have the accessibility of just getting in their car or getting on a train or a bus to go and vote in person.
Yeah, I can agree more. And look, we just kind of came into the game of vote by mail ourselves, which I'm super proud of and happy that we worked on. And we know it works, and we know people liked it when we did it in the emergency setting with AB Ford, thanks to Speaker Frierson last special session when we did it. And now we've made it permanent thanks to Speaker Frierson in this regular session. And so we know Nevadans like options when it comes to voting, and they proved that in the 2020 election. So I think it's super important. Laura, I want to come to you. We are continuing to see tactics all across the country. We know that, voting is a fundamental right that all Americans have. Why do you think that, in particular, Republicans on this bill continue to push back against this and not want to pass this? Why do you think they continue to be obstructionist when it comes to this type of legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about, people know our country is changing. It's becoming more diverse. It's becoming more urban. It's becoming more educated. And some people want to hold on to power any way they can. And I think a good example of that, I think it was 2016 or maybe 18, there was that night, I think it was the last day of early voting. And I believe it was the same night, the Republican Party and Adam Laxalt demanded that the vote center at the Home Depot in Silverado Ranch remain open because there was a long line, but they wanted to close the early voting center at Cardenas. So if you're from Las Vegas, you know the difference between Silverado Ranch and Cardenas, and why Adam Laxalt would want one to stay open and to close the other while people are still in line. I know it may sound simplistic. It may seem kind of, some hyperbole here, but I really think that people do not like seeing women, people of color, enter in these places where for so long they have been kept out. When Plan was founded in 1994, Bob Fulkerson, our founder, tells us about 80% of the registered voters in Nevada were white, and close to 90% of the elected officials were white. And so part of Plan's mission has always been to deepen democracy. And that means removing these artificial barriers that exist to people actually participating in democracy. And that is definitely one thing that we honor Senator Reed for, is he also saw that writing on the wall. And he invested so much in Asian communities, Hispanic and Latinx communities, Black communities. He invested in veterans and rural, because he knew when he was running for re-election, and if other people needed to get elected, there needed to be a vast multiracial coalition of people, which includes white people, voting and exercising their voices and participating. If only a select few of people who are off on Saturdays and only work a 9 to 5 when the polls are open in the evening can vote, this state would look so different. Our legislative makeup would look so different. I doubt it would be majority female. I doubt we would see so many people of color and women in leadership. And so some people just have a problem with that. And we have to be stronger, those people. And again, I know that some people think, is democracy worth fighting for? I vote and I don't get my way. I get that. But we also have to understand and remember the good that we did. We would have never decriminalized traffic tickets if we didn't elect people who agreed with us. we would never see the amazing work in the North Las Vegas courts to squash bench warrants if we hadn't worked to elect people to those courts, elect judges. And that is part of democracy. We get to decide who these people who are running, and we elect them based on our shared wants and needs and desires to be seen in our community. That is what democracy is. Democracy is not big corporations like the mining industry dumping money on candidates who will protect their profits. Democracy is ensuring the people at Thacker Pass, the people who live by the Cortez mine, they get to decide what happens in their communities. They get to elect the people who are responsible to them, not a billionaire in Canada. So we really have to think deeply about what is happening here, because I cannot stress enough. If people can continue to pick apart our elections, can continue to think of ways to make it harder for us to vote or more frustrating for us to vote, it's going to trickle down to other things. If you think, it's frustrating now going to the DMV, imagine if all the people who are elected got there who are in charge of these state programs, food stamps, veteran assistance, your social security. If the people who got there because they made it so people couldn't vote. And so they got there by default. So really, really need, and that's what our plan is going to be doing a lot of this year, is a lot of just education and talking to our base and building out our base and building that bigger we around the power that we have to really change our circumstances here in Nevada. But it really starts with just participating.
This morning, Laura, I was talking to one of our counterparts in another state, and they asked me, what makes Nevada unique and special? And I said, Nevada looks like what the rest of the country is going to look like in 10 to 15 years. We're already ahead on that, right? We have, like you said, women and people of color in positions of power. We are, our groups are so powerful in this state. And in other states, they don't have the power that they have in Nevada. Why is it so important for the rest of the country to start moving forward on issues like voting rights now? Or why is it important for us to have a federal law so that we can make sure that things are uniform across the country now, so we can kind of get ahead of that? Because the rest of the country is going to change, and it is going to become more diverse.
Mm-hmm. Well, like Bradley said, it's been 10 years since the Supreme Court gutted federal oversight of elections. And it's been 10 years and nothing happened. So how much longer then would we have to wait as we move forward? Like, there has to be a sense of urgency, because unfortunately things do take a long time. It's kind of like those big shipping tanks in the Suez Canal. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of hands doing a lot of work to slowly turn things around. And so we have to get started now, because again, people do see that writing on the wall. They see that, I think the number is 7 out of 10 Clark County kindergartners are non-white. People know what is coming here, and they want to find a way to hold on to power. And unfortunately, one way to do that is to keep people from voting, to keep people from having a voice in their own communities. And so we can't risk the next election, the next legislative session. It's right now that we have to do that work, and we have to get serious about it.
Thank you for that, Laura. We'll get to audience questions in just a few minutes. I got a couple more questions for Bradley, and then we'll come to the audience. So make sure that you're putting them in the chat. I see a bunch coming in now, so we'll get right back to you on those. So Bradley, I want to come back to you. The Freedom to Vote Act actually has a provision designed to stop dark money from impacting elections. Is this provision important for limiting the amount of corruption that can easily influence elections through campaign finance laws, especially in light of, the different campaign finance laws that have kind of rolled through over the past 10 years as well? How do we make sure that there's some accountability there around those campaign finance laws?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent, if overlooked, part of what these bills would have done had they seen the light of day. And I was about to say, wow, we are very lucky in many ways to live in Nevada, because of organizations headed by the likes of the three of you that work so hard to have the things in this state already that the Freedom to Vote Act would give to the rest of the country: automatic voter registration, same day, online, early voting, mail voting, felony restoration, all of those things we already have. So much like our forebears 30 years ago thought to enshrine reproductive rights to protect us from what's happening to Roe v. Wade, we have always been ahead of the curve on very important issues like this, and we are on voting rights. And then, of course, you brought up money in politics, and I will say that as an election lawyer, we do not have a very robust campaign finance regime and enforcement here in Nevada. But I'm also sort of pessimistic about that generally, because there's sort of two ways you can go when it comes to money in politics. You can try to get as much money out of politics as possible, which I think is very, very hard to do, especially after Citizens United, which means essentially, candidates campaigns, though they fight over how much money they raised and they like to have these big splashes with their announcements like they did yesterday. Candidates, I'm not going to say they don't matter, but their campaigns aren't what they used to be, right? Giving outside money, independent expenditures in an important race can absolutely dwarf and make unimportant what a candidate themselves raises, and can essentially hijack a message. Independent expenditures can make a race about something that a candidate has no control over, or conversely, a candidate can sit back and know that someone else is going to pay for and handle their campaign, and they essentially don't have to put themselves forward. So, since Citizens United, there's almost no way to get money out of politics in that way. So the other way to approach money in politics is to use the old-fashioned disinfectant of sunlight, right? To make it as transparent as possible. We're going to have this kind of money in politics, but we need to know where it's coming from, who's spending it, and all of that. Know where the money is, right? Know how much, know where, know how it's being spent, all that. I'm not entirely sure anymore that does us all that much good. Should we have that? Of course we should. We should have that transparency. Is that information going to be useful to a lot of the people who have to go to the polls and vote? I don't know anymore. The information flow in this society is so poor and so siloed and so given to, well, frankly, outright lying for personal benefit. That I'm just very pessimistic about money in politics generally. So would it be better to have dark money exposed? Absolutely right. Will it make that much of a difference to know that a certain special interest group is supporting Adam Laxalt or someone else? I mean, in essence, we already know that, right? I mean, it's no secret. It's sort of what interests people are speaking for when they run for office. So, is it better than that? Yes. Is it going to be crucial to our democracy going forward? I'm less convinced, I think.
Let me be devil's advocate for a minute. So when we engage though with politicians, as Laura was saying earlier, we know oftentimes money speaks to politicians. It's something that I encounter a lot when I'm working and dealing with politicians of all parties. I mean, that is just the nature of this beast, unfortunately. Do you think if there was more daylight on people who donate to the Kirsten Cinemas of the world and the Joe Manchins of the world, and, some of these people who are now voting against, really important pieces of legislation, probably because they are getting money from groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and other kind of special interests that are not pro-democracy. Isn't that important, though, for when people are doing research on these candidates to know that they're getting money from those special interests?
Yes, of course it is. Absolutely right. But on its own, that doesn't do all that much, right? What it does is provide opportunities for organizing. It's a point of information around which people can organize to attack that particular system or those interests or the people that are speaking for those interests. So yes, that's important to know, but the key will always be the action that it spurs, right? The organizing opportunities and efforts that people still have to engage in to make those things worthwhile. So is that another arena around which people can rally to defeat someone like Kristen Sinema? Absolutely right. And I saw today the favorability in her state is in single digits. Is that I saw that right today, correct? I don't know what that means to a politician like her. She seems impervious to things of that nature. It's like she seems impervious to calls for democracy or reason. So, I mean, what is it when you run up with someone like that, whose sense of shame is zero? I'm not sure what it would do in that case. Maybe in most cases, attacking the funding and the interest behind someone like that would matter. In someone like her's case, and she just happens to at the moment stand at a crucial hinge in our ability to move forward as a country, right, on all these crucial issues because of the lack of filibuster reform. So maybe she's a special case. But in someone like that's instance, I'm not sure that it matters at all.
Yeah. Yeah, she doesn't seem to really care what her constituents think, unfortunately. And I just, I say this a lot about politicians. A lot of times they are not doing what their constituents elected them to do, but I've never seen something like her. She is just a whole different ball of wax. Before I get to the audience questions, Bradley, I did want to bring this up because I think this is an important note. Democrats are not perfect. I will be the first person to criticize them on a regular basis. I know Laura and Emily have too. But in this moment, it really is the Republicans who are obstructing a lot of these different bills. And how historic is it that no Republicans will even support these bills? Even with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, there was Republican support for that. They forget their own history about this stuff. So I just don't understand how we're at this point now where Republicans just refuse to support anything and do the right thing on this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's even more recent than that, right? I mean, the last time the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized was in 2006, and it was reauthorized, I think, unanimously, with not just bipartisan support, overwhelming support. And so, the inability to even have these conversations, we look at Manchin and Sinema now, and they're sort of taking the focus, right? Our ire is focused upon those two. And you're absolutely right. The entire GOP is sort of slipping all of the blame for not just refusing to support, essentially refusing to engage. I mean, if you remember John Roberts' opinion when he gutted or provided the vote that gutted the Voting Rights Act, it was that we've moved beyond racial politics in this country. It's a new South. You don't need to worry about Georgia or South Carolina or Tennessee or any of those places. Everything has changed, right? We're going to move forward. There's no need for pre-clearance or any of those things. You cannot tell me that it isn't worth having a good faith conversation about whether that was true at the time, and if it remains true given the last 10 years, not only of electoral performance, but of the laws being passed or considered throughout not just the South, but all over America. So the fact that we can't even have that discussion with the counterparts of the Democrats on the other side is shocking and disappointing, but I guess that's where we are, and it's going to get much worse before it gets better.
All right, I want to move to audience questions. I'm going to open it up to the three of you. All of you, please just jump in. I know you all have plenty to say on this stuff. And we're going to get to the filibuster because you cannot have this conversation without talking about the filibuster. So we are, and I was saying that, Senator Reid was probably haunting some people last night after that whole thing went down. So Jessica from the Las Vegas Sun asks, what would change about Nevada's elections if the freedom to vote bill did pass? And is there anything that would and should be fixed about Nevada's election operations? So Emily, if you want to go first, and then we'll just kind of popcorn from there.
I think overall, the John Lewis Act would have, if anything, it would have strengthened our election policies that we have. I think there are a couple of things that in my opinion, would have been a little bit better that we don't currently have. One of them is university IDs. This is something that through our work, we see time after time, that there are college students that wish that they could use their university ID as a form of identification. And this bill would have allowed them to use it during the signature curing process. And also first-time voters would have been able to use it. It would have established Election Day as a federal holiday. That's not something that we experience right here in the state of Nevada as a state holiday. And folks would have received pay and been able to go and participate in our election on Election Day. And actually, one of the things that I think is really important that most people don't think about is that it would have created a state democracy promotion program. And that program would have provided funds to states to improve their voting administration and their infrastructure. Having a good election system, Bradley and I have had many conversations around this, like it's expensive. And to have it as secure as can be costs a lot of money. And so having something that, the federal government would have been able to assist with, I think would have been such a great resource for us.
Laura, Bradley.
I mean, I think everything Emily just said, and also, I don't know if you said the making Election Day a national holiday. I've heard a lot of people talk about that. Obviously, we enjoy a few weeks of early voting, but also just having a national holiday would just be great too for a lot of people.
Yeah, let me just say that I agree with all of that. The Election Day holiday, would be primarily useful for those states that don't have the voting opportunities we do. And I want to put a small plug in here for the officials in this state that have made our elections so successful in recent years, because what the Freedom to Vote Act would have done is it would have moved a lot of America to look like elections in Nevada, which are stunningly successful. And people, elsewhere, when you tell them we have incredible elections in Nevada, that doesn't really compute for them. But someone like Joe Gloria, who has been an absolute stalwart for voting rights and has moved us away from precinct-based voting, which is, it's ancient now. You can go anywhere and vote anytime in your county. Vote centers, so you don't have to go to your local fire station anymore. He has fought for hour after hour being added to early votes. Aaron Ford has been an excellent attorney general in voting rights and will not brook intimidation or other kinds of bullshit at the polls. That's not happening on his watch. I mean, it takes that sort of system-wide effort. But the Freedom to Vote Act would have moved the rest of the country in the direction Nevadans have been enjoying for a while now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to move to the filibuster because that is a big part of this. We absolutely need to reform the filibuster. I was listening to the debate last night and hearing some of the history of the filibuster. The filibuster wasn't even written in by the original founding fathers. This was something they some cockamamie scheme they came up with after to literally stall votes. I mean, that was the whole purpose of this. And then it came into fruition after they figured out, well, this is a stalling tactic if we don't like something the other side is doing, who's in control. So the filibuster in the Senate rule votes kept us, and this is from Maria, this filibuster in the Senate rule votes kept us from ever getting an actual vote on the bill itself. How can we continue this way where the Senate is just where dreams and bills go to die? Bradley, you want to start us off on this one and we'll go to Laura?
Yeah, I got a couple of thoughts about the filibuster generally. It's, other than getting enough senators to break a filibuster to break the filibuster, it's sort of a repeating problem, right? But, the sort of criticisms of it are obvious. The filibuster doesn't just stop things from working in the Senate. It also deforms our politics, because if everyone knows that there's very little chance of substantive policies being adopted in any particular Congress because of the lack of a supermajority, you are free at that point to literally say whatever you want. You can play to your base. You can act the fool. You can go as far right as you want to go because it doesn't matter, right? You are essentially playing with house money because it's built into the process that nothing's going to happen. And I don't buy these arguments that I've seen columnists over and over talking about how, oh, if we get rid of the filibuster, the wild swings of policy. Well, as far as I can tell, as you said, Annette, the filibuster is not something that was handed down to us from Athenian democracy, right? There's nothing hallowed about this. In fact, it has terrible racist Jim Crow lineage to it. But the United Kingdom, for all its faults, has had a parliament for a millennium without any type of supermajority requirement. And they simply talk it out and vote on things, and that's called politics. So you face up to the consequences of the policies you enact, and the voters get to make decisions and free and fair elections thereafter. That's how it ought to be doing, and I'm certainly not afraid of what would happen if the filibuster were to go away. It should be gone this minute.
Absolutely. Laura, I want to bring you in on, I'm sure you have some fire on this as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like we should abolish the Senate because it's not fair representation. There's no reason why people from North Dakota, West Virginia should have the power over people from California or even Texas. It's just a tyranny of the minority. And I think people have convinced themselves it's a balance on power. But is it really? I even see the same in Nevada. I guess maybe our mini filibuster to the 2/3 majority for taxes. I don't think, knowing who our Democrats are, I don't think if there was no 2/3 threshold, they're not going to go crazy raising taxes. They're going to be just as scared as they are with the 2/3 vote. But I think while we talk about some of these things that, these kind of like what I said, these artificial barriers to voting, these artificial barriers to participating in democracy, and that includes the infrastructure of our government. And the filibuster is a huge problem because it is just a way for people who lose power to somehow hold on to it in very insidious ways. And so I agree with folks who also just want to abolish the Senate.
I mean, we're just getting rid of whole ass chambers now. I mean, do what you got to do. I always say the Senate's where dreams go to die. So yeah. Emily, go ahead. You want to weigh in? You're on mute, babe.
I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on with my Zoom today. I was just going to say
it's Mercury in retrograde. All the electronics are just out of whack. So it's okay. We're rolling with it tonight.
I mean, I was just going to say the Senate's where dreams go to die, both nationally and locally. So, it is what it is. But no, I mean, I think both of them hit it on the nail around the filibuster. I mean, it's BS, it's bullshit. I mean, and it's not the first time that we have a monumental issue that's affected by the filibuster. I mean, how many times has immigration been affected by the filibuster? I mean, I think we've lost count at this particular time. So, like, it's got to go.
And I want to be clear, revisionist history is fun, especially when you're dealing with insurrectionists. So yes, Democrats and Republicans have used the filibuster various times, various ways. Senator Reid used the filibuster when he was majority leader, but has since then, before his death, even come to say it is time to get rid of the filibuster. It doesn't have a place anymore in the United States Senate. So even somebody who was in power, who understood power, who, in my humble opinion, was, incredibly strategic and powerful in that chamber, much more than Chuck Schumer, he understood that this was a cancer within the Senate to getting things done. And I think, honestly, to honor him, if nothing else, they should get rid of it just for that. So that's my 2 cents on the matter. Bradley, you want to chime in on that?
No, I think that's right. I will also say that coming from the sort of left side of the aisle, it is easy to propose all these things you would do if you could, but you're not going to get to 60. So it has been something that the right has used to avoid the sort of power of the majority to enact its program, but it's also been used by the left to propose things rhetorically when they have no intention or ability of actually following through. So that's what I mean when I say it has deformed our politics in a way that no one has to be serious if nothing's ever going to happen.
Okay, I want to get to this question. It's really important, and I think it's important when talking about the insurrection and a lot of the disinformation that exists out there in our political atmosphere right now. So Shelby asks, how do we counter messaging from the right that our elections are vulnerable or stolen or broken? All of this nonsense that Adam Laxalt put out there and is already putting out there before an election has even happened in Nevada. How do we start to counter that? So Laura, I'm going to start with you because I know you have excellent communications skills.
I don't know about all that, but sometimes it's hard. There's some people that just seem simply unreachable. And I think with so much access to so many different forms of communication, you have Newsmax, ONA Network, Fox News, all of these things, who knows where people are getting their information from. But I think that we have to provide to our people, kind of going back to what I was saying, creating the bigger we don't need to go tit for tat with people like Adam Laxalt, but I think a policy of non-engagement is a failure. We have to make sure our folks know our elections are safe. We have to reach out beyond that circle and bring more people into our base and talk about how elections are won, how people can cast their vote, the changes that have been made because people are voting, and make sure people know that, frankly, any blips in our elections are few and far between. And recently it seemed that those have been derived from Republicans trying to vote for dead people. So we just have to continue to build the truth and not necessarily try to convince Adam Laxalt's true believers, but making sure we're talking to our folks and building out that base and being those trusted voices to talk about how secure our elections are and always have been.
Emily?
I mean, Laura said it exactly right. I mean, I think that the narrative has just gone so far beyond that. We have really just lost sight that voting rights in itself, election administration, election integrity, all of those are nonpartisan issues. What has happened here is that one party, and like I work for a nonpartisan organization, all of our work is not to favor one political party over another, but one party got pissed off because of results of one particular election cycle. They further got pissed off because of January 5th. I mean, they have hijacked the narrative and make it all about January 6th. But the reality is that they just continue to get pissed off because of January 5th, right? And I actually had forgotten about that on my own, but I was watching Senator John Ossoff, one of my favorites, his speech about the filibuster when he was talking about that. And the reality is that especially in the state of Nevada, our elections systems are safe. I have Annette, many of us have sat there, have monitored, have asked questions, and I just I can't even emphasize how accessible, we have a Republican Secretary of State, Barbara Sagaski, who I don't always agree with on a day-to-day basis. However, her and her office make themselves super accessible. They do everything they possibly can to ensure that they're upholding the law, the letter of the law, and the spirit of the law. And we have so many amazing red stars like Joe Gloria. It's his birthday today. So Joe, if you're watching, happy birthday. But we have so many different things in our state that we know that our election laws and the systems that we have in play are the right ones. What viewers have to actually, I think we also have to do a better job as community organizations and really doing that deep education and countering all of nonsense out there. But I also think that voters have to take the time and actually doing the research. Just because you see something on CNN or just because you see something on Fox News doesn't mean that that's actually the truth, right? Like, do your research and actually what's happening. Call your election officials, go down and monitor and volunteer and see for yourself that our election systems are amazing, and volunteer to be a poll worker.
That's right. I mean, these election systems are intentionally open. If you want to work the polls, if you want to be a part of the process, Emily's right. I've sat through them ballot counting. I've observed. I've, done poll monitoring. You can do all those things too. And it's not a partisan thing, that they welcome everyone. And so if you want to see how our election process works day to day, I encourage you, instead of shouting about dumb things that don't make any sense, actually go and observe it for yourself, because you'll see how secure this election system is. Bradley, I know you've done a lot of work with the Secretary of State's office. You've done a lot of work all around the state protecting people's rights to vote. How do we push back on this disinformation that somehow our, elections are rigged and all of this other nonsense, which is completely false?
Yeah. Laura put her finger on it as well, which is, it depends on who you're trying to convince. I have struggled with this for a long time. There is a vast segment of society now that it is pointless to have this discussion with. There is no way to bring them back from this precipice. I mean, I've just spent the last 2 days, and I'll spend one more tomorrow, in workshops with the Secretary of State's office, public workshops, who yesterday, today, and tomorrow have been workshopping new regulations stemming from the changes in our election law over the last couple of years. And it is, first of all, the attendance is very bad. And it is exactly the people you would expect to sign up for these kinds of things, making exactly the comments you would expect. It is like the shittiest Facebook group ever come to life to scream at Barbara Sagavsky's people, who, as Emily, points out as well, are incredibly patient and open and willing to engage in these discussions. Mark Vlashin deserves a statue. I couldn't do it because they're essentially, calling Barbara Sagavsky a socialist, which, first of all, that would be awesome, but secondly, not true. She's just doing her job. But the people who need to have confidence that that elections are secure, many of them we can't reach. The people that we can reach are much more concerned that they're able to vote, right? Not that their vote will be miscounted or that it will be rigged once they get there, but that they are being left out of the process entirely. That elections are rigged not by gremlins getting in the machine or someone miscounting or throwing their ballot away, but that they're being left out of the process entirely. That they're being annoyed in a way that they are not, having a convenient method of voting. Our focus, I think, though it's important to reiterate how good Joe Gloria is and how clean our elections are and how the sort of claims of fraud are insidious, stupid, and outright wrong. Most of our energy is better focused in registering people, getting to the polls, and inspiring their participation. And when they see the results of those things, the questions regarding whether an election is fair or free or not will fade into the background because the results will be there. So that's how I see it.
Awesome. All right. We got a couple more questions and then we can call it an evening. So Pat says, is there a way to export the strategies and the ways that we have utilized to elect progressive legislators to our state offices and our federal offices, I would add too, and get more great legislation accomplished? And my answer to that is always, well, yes, we should be organizing in all of these states. But Laura, I'm going to kick it back to you because I think you'll have probably a deeper opinion on how we kind of export the success we've had here in Nevada to other places.
Yeah, I think it's just continuing the pieces on base building, on leadership development, and just showing leadership outside of our state. We are connected to a lot of organizations based in other states. We have senators who can work on their colleagues. That's also another thing that I appreciated about Senator Reed is he would tell us the other states that were struggling and what they were struggling on, and then we can go to our organizing partners and work with them and get those people in the place they needed to be, because the big difference between Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer is Harry Reid didn't bring bills to the floor unless he knew it was going to pass, which is a good strategy to have. So I think we just have to remember that our world is getting smaller in a way, but it's giving us access to people in different states and best practices and the ability for us to have just have each other's backs, and there's strength in that, knowing that if somebody says, oh, we can't do ballot collection, we can say it works in Nevada. Rural Nevadans need that because they don't get regular postage service. And so that's just what we have to continue to keep doing.
Emily, Bradley, anything you want to add to that about exporting our successes here in Nevada? All right. Okay, next question is, do you all think there will be any accountability? Specifically, I know we talked about cinema already, and we have seen recently NARAL has pulled their support. I think some other national groups are going to probably start pulling their support of her. But, you know, how do we, I think here in Nevada, hold Sinema and Manchin accountable, but also hold the Republicans accountable as well? I think we need to, again, like Bradley said, not leave them out of this because they're just as complicit as the other two. Anyone want to pipe in on that?
You know, I think we're headed into a really difficult time. I mean, the failure of the voting bills over the last few days mean that the 22 and 24 elections are going to be contested under rules that are going to be increasingly difficult for Democrats to hold places like Georgia or to win in places like Arizona. And it may cause us more difficulties in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. The problem with all of this, and I'm trying not to be as pessimistic as I'm sure I'm coming across, is that once these things become sort of the way of the world in those states, it will be incredibly difficult to overcome them in the future. Once those structural barriers are there, you know, it's going to be very hard to pull them down. So you know, as much as I hate to say it, the sort of minoritarian strength of the Republicans in those places, absent, and it's unbelievable that it comes down to the decisions of two people like Manchin and Sinema, and I do hate to keep bringing it back to them, but that's what their failure to stand up for these basic rights is going to lead us into. The way out of that, I don't know. You know, I mean, we've been sitting here talking about how 10 years ago, it's been 10 years since the destruction of the Voting Rights Act. I shudder to think that that we'll look back 10 years from now and say, God, do you remember when they repealed Roe? When are we going to pull that back? I mean, it's the sort of the pillars of a functioning society are coming down before our eyes. And you know, sort of wringing our hands about a particular vote in the Senate, or the success of a particular candidate or two, or the rhetoric of Manchin or Sinema, it's just not going to do it. Right? We're going to have a new politics, a new language, and a new way of attacking these problems, because these ways are clearly failing right in front of us every day now.
Yeah, so I'm glad well, I'm not glad you brought this up, but I mean, it's part of this, right? We also have the issue of abortion lingering before the Supreme Court, which is also a failing institution, as Will so poignantly pointed out to me in our chat as we have this going, you know, that institution is failing us as well. And so, you know, as Emily pointed out earlier, all of these issues are intersectional. You know, if we don't have voting rights, which is a fundamental basic right, how can we have a human right like abortion as well? And I think all of this is kind of tied together, and it's the rights attack on people of color, women, people who have uteruses, you know, any of those types of humans that have disproportionately been disenfranchised in this country. So, you know, how does voting rights tie into the fight to keep safe and legal abortion in this country? And, as we go into this Roe versus Wade anniversary on Saturday, what should people be thinking about it with the tie between voting rights and abortion rights? Emily, you want to start?
Yes, finally my button worked. Okay. I mean, I think it's so essential. It's so basic to the level of, if we don't have people with the ability to be able to register to vote, to be able to go out and cast their ballot for the candidates that are going to be able to make the decisions that serve in the best interest of their constituents, there is no way that we're going to be able to make any level of advancement in protecting abortion rights or really any other issue. And so I think that when we really think about, the issue really that you're talking about today is abortion, but when we're talking about any particular issue, it always has to be first centered in democracy, in being able to have accessible democracy for anyone. I think it's just as simple as that, honestly.
Laura?
So say the question one more time. Sorry, I was like imagining as Emily was speaking.
So talking about the tie between Roe versus Wade and our fight for keeping abortion safe and legal in this country, and the fight for voting rights, because oftentimes it will impact the same people. We will see the same type of people oppressed, right, because of those things going away. But there's also an intersection in having the right to vote and also being able to have your own reproductive freedom.
Yeah, and I was kind of thinking back to what Bradley was saying earlier about, the foremothers of our progressive movement had this knowledge to enshrine Roe v. Wade in the Constitution. And I just feel like it shouldn't have to always be that way. We can't have our rights protected just by someone having, the foreshadowing enough to be able to do that. And so, again, it goes back to what I keep trying to say, like, you may think voting is not your thing, or, elections, politics, but it really is how our society is able to function. If we don't have a working democracy, it's going to be nearly impossible to do the things that we need to do to protect bodily autonomy, reproductive justice, to do more to hold police accountable. It'll just become more and more difficult. It's already difficult now. And so we have to remember, unfortunately, our ability to access abortion, our ability to access birth control is tied to our ability to vote. And that, again, is why you see so many attacks and so much misinformation, which is also a form of voter suppression out there in the world, because there are people who just don't want that to happen.
Bradley, I know you and I have talked about this one a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be exceptionally brief, and I'll just say that the failure to codify in federal law the protections of Roe v. Wade over the last half century is, in essence, is a symbol of all of this, right? This sort of expectation that it'll never get that bad, right? That the norm will always be upheld. We are now living in a situation where norms don't matter anymore, and it's not just abortion. It's going to be voting. It's going to be other things. The time for this sort of lazy bourgeois sleepwalking is over. Right, it's the right loves to shout to its adherents, "Wake up!" Well, there's a lot of waking up needs to be done, and the failure to protect the protections of Roe v. Wade over the last 50 years is an incredible tragedy that was never prioritized, and now we will reap the whirlwind because of it, and it won't be the last whirlwind we're forced to reap.
Yeah, people having the ability to make their own choices about their bodies is, I think, just as fundamental as the right to vote, right? And all of this is so tied together. And going back to the beginning of this conversation, I think it's all about control, and it's all about oppression, and trying to make it harder for people to function in our society who have historically been oppressed. So on that depressing note, Emily, you want to chime in? Go ahead.
I just, as Bradley was saying, and this is definitely not him, he's the very exception to this, but I think the one thing that voting rights and reproductive rights, and especially abortion, the one thing that they have in common is that in both issues, white heterosexual wealthy men think that they know better. And they think that they should be the ones that are making the decisions on what's best for communities of color, on being able to vote. And they also think that they should have the ability to control whether women can have an abortion or not, or have access to birth control or not. And I think that's something that we should really give a lot more thought to. Why are we consistently allowing men of this stature to make the decisions that affect us on a day-to-day basis? I think it's something that we don't talk about enough. And it's something that I know that the three of us fight against each and every day. And it's not okay. And I think that, a lot of people are probably discouraged now, especially in these two, particular issues. But now more than ever, if anything, as Laura had said, like, we should not be disillusioned. Now is the time we should be participating more than ever. And there's a lot at stake in this particular election, and things could go south, but we shouldn't allow that to happen. We should be using our voice to ensure that we don't further roll back.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Emily. Bradley,
Yeah,
I'll just
add one thing to that, which is, and I absolutely take that point, and I'll also say that the women in this country who will be least affected by the fall of Roe v. Wade are wealthier women who can make it to the state where they can get their abortion on their demand, and so it's a problem of multifaceted aspects.
Well, and it's also the wealthy white women who are also problematic and vote for Republicans and vote against our own best interests. So for all the white women out there, let's go talk to the fellow white women of ours and make sure that they're not voting against their own best interests and voting against our fellow sisters and trans folk in the community who need us now more than ever. So let's stop oppressing people and upholding white supremacy that has been put on us for centuries. But that's a whole nother day and a whole nother topic. But it is a part of this conversation because Emily is right. It's 100% tied to our ability to make our choices about voting, our ability to exercise our right to vote, and our ability to access all kinds of healthcare. So I want to just say that now. But final thoughts for this episode, final thoughts on where we go from here for voting rights, for reproductive freedom, for all of the different issues that we work on, because like Emily said, it's all tied back to voting rights. So Laura, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I feel like I just want to end by saying, we are in just such a peculiar place. We're in almost a halfway point for the Biden administration, where historically voter turnout is pretty bad, and that could shift the balance of power in both the House and Senate. And both have already said, we will just obstruct. On Eastern and the 95, a bridge literally collapsed on a Nevada Department of Transportation worker. I just saw a news flash come up saying, the bridge was worse than they thought. So while they were repairing it, it fell on top of them. Those are the things that Mitch McConnell and the House Majority Leader are preventing from happening. If you are upset that your schools aren't getting, the HVAC upgrades or the cleaning upgrades, there are people standing in the way of that. If you are upset that we don't have the public transportation, if you don't want to take a train to Victorville, you'd rather take a train down Maryland Parkway, people are holding up those transportation dollars from the federal government. We did manage to pass the bipartisan infrastructure fund, but so much more stuff other than the Build Back Better plan will be held up. And that includes citizenship. That includes things like voting rights, protecting us from the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. And so it is critical that we really get serious. I know we always say every election is the most critical election of your lifetime, but really, we can't let Mitch McConnell get back into power. And the other guy, I hate him so much, I can't remember his name, in the House, where he will give Marjorie Taylor Greene access to committees that she's already been removed from. Like, we really have to get on it. And it's not just, I'm not saying vote blue no matter who. I'm not one of those people. I'm saying people are going to start filing for office in about 2 months. make sure it's our people, help them out, knock their doors, donate money to them, get them in the position that they can actually win. That is what our democracy is about, not just showing up on election day, but really showing up every day.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you brought up Build Back Better, because that is another failure that we didn't even get to in this segment, because voting rights is so important. But, that's another huge thing that was held up over the holiday break and not passed, that Nevadans and Americans were counting on. The child tax credit alone was saving people's life. And that has been held up because of the Republicans and Mitch McConnell and Sinema and Joe Manchin again. So let's not forget when we go to the ballot boxes who's doing what. Bradley, any final thoughts that you have on this?
Yeah, but they're not very good ones. I say this, pretty much every time I come on this show. It's going to get much, much worse before it gets better. In fact, I'm not always sure it's going to get better. But all we can do is find our comrades, work as hard as we can, never give up for your children and your families. And it's always darkest right before the dawn, but let's get through the darkness because it's here.
Yeah, I feel like it's, just raining down every day. Thursday, I post today on Facebook. It's Thursday, also known as the fourth day of the hostage situation. So Emily, your final thoughts on where we're at right now and where we need to go.
I was just noticing that the three of us all wore black today. I wonder, and that was not intentional and coordinated. But look, I think that, one of the first roles I had was in this movement is conducting voter registration. And one of the things that I always heard on the field and still hear is when asking folks like, hey, are you registered to vote? Is, I'm not interested, like nothing, what's voting going to do for me? And what I've always said is that every literal thing that happens in this universe is affected by politics in some shape or form. Whether you're pissed about the rate of your tuition at UNLV or CSN or NSC, or you're pissed that you don't have, lights at a particular crosswalk, or you're like me, that's pissed that I don't have a bathroom at my local park, or whatever it is, there is no way to make any particular change in any of those things if you don't actually participate in voting and voting for the people that are going to make changes in the issues that you care about. This is an election, I don't really get that concerned. I get a little worried, but I haven't been this worried about an election probably since 2014. And now more than ever, folks have to make sure that they are not just staying at home, that they're not getting tired of political ads or what have you. Pay attention, because these are going to be the people that are making decisions that affect your day-to-day life. So pretty soon we'll have our voter guide up, Vote Smart NV. And so make sure that you're going on and getting educated as to what's happening, because these are going to be the people that are, making the choices. And as kind of Laura said earlier, if you're not happy with how things are going, then stop being pissed off and run for office yourself. We need more people that look like us and that have our past experiences to step up to the plate and run for office so that you can make the change in our state and in our country.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Emily. And thank you all. This is an important topic. It's one that we should all be concerned with. It is something that we need to all kind of buckle up and get ready for, because this is the fight of our lives. And we are going to have to fight on every single issue that we care about in this election. And Laura's right. Every cycle we say this is the most important election of your life. I mean, if we didn't learn that lesson in 2016, I don't know what will wake people up at this point. But, as somebody who's worked in reproductive rights for a long time and done voting rights for a long time now, this is the election of our lives. And yes, things feel really bad right now and things feel really hard. And, having just had COVID, it feels extra hard. But I think now more than ever is the time where we have to fight back, and we can't continue to let these things fly that have flown for so long in this country and here in the state. And so we're going to need every single one of you to get that done. And so that is why we do these informational sessions. That's why we do Out in Front, is to give you this information so we can fight back. And obviously Plan is doing amazing work. Silver State Voices and all of our partners at the table do incredible work every single day. So we encourage you, join those organizations, help us fight back, help us get involved with the election. We're going to need every single one of you. And Emily's 100% right. We're getting our voter guide ready now. We just brought a new staff member on to help us with that, Brian. You'll get introduced to him in the next couple of weeks. But we will be putting out our voter guide for the primary all across the state in June. And so you should be looking forward to that. So I want to thank our guests tonight. I want to say thank you for all of your hard work on the Voting Rights Act and all of the things that you all do every day. Again, get involved with our organizations. Make sure that you're volunteering your time, whether that's in person or online if you need to stay safe. And we will be back Out in Front with you next week on Thursday evening. So make sure you get vaccinated and keep wearing your mask, everyone, because COVID is real. We'll talk to y'all soon. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you for joining.